Hello, everybody. It's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? Just doing a quick video to give you some info about Section C. This is the reflection section. I know I said we'd talk about this in class, but we've been doing other things. And so just a quick video about the reflection section. What is it that you're looking to do? This is the very last section of the HI, and it follows Section B, which is the investigation. Definitely spend a good amount of your time on Part B. Part C is important. It's also worth a lot. It's not as many points. And also, I think it is much shorter. So I think it's something that you can work on and write in your voice and, kind of do, compared to the Part B, which will take a little bit longer to organize and to develop. So, what is Part C? You're really asked to create a reflection of about a page. Think of this as like maybe two paragraphs, maybe three, and I'll highlight an example of one. But you're looking to describe how your HI process really emulated the work of an historian, but that's like a small part of it. No need to discuss every single part of your research project that is the work done by an historian. Kind of focus on a particular method that maybe is important for you in your project. Maybe you spent time interpreting and adding context to primary and secondary sources, in a particular topic. And maybe that was especially challenging to do because you were dealing with the Middle Ages and some of the context might have been, so you're looking to find some methods that you used, but you're using some of that to get into the bigger part of the reflection, which is a question about what do historians find challenging, not in general, but an historian who is researching your question would likely come across some similar type sources. You did an OPCVL, so you've already noted limitations to some of your sources. So you kind of told your reader, in a sense, that there are some problems with your sources. Maybe they're dated. Maybe the primary sources are, somewhat, the purpose of the source is very, very limited because it is directed at an audience, and it's harder to interpret. There's all kinds of things that you can pull from your OPCVLs and even about the sources that you didn't OPCVL that gives you a very, kind of a way in to this question about what methods used by historians did I tap into, not listing all of them, but focusing on one or two examples. And then also, what are some challenges that face the historian? And, we know that historians use sources to, and select sources in order to develop, to interpret and then develop, historical narratives. And some things about the discipline of history, that make it different from other subjects like math, where there may be a more definitive answer. We know that history gets constructed. The process and the product that we call history, gets constructed. And there are lots of different ways historians go about that process. Different historians may actually reach different conclusions. Sometimes there's multiple perspectives on the same historical event, so you can have competing historical narratives. And in some cases, we might have just a variety of different kinds of sources that offer you information, but don't necessarily offer you complete information. They have to be used in tandem or corroborated by other sources. So there's a lot of things about the historian process that you're all working on. Tap into some of those things and keep it specific. So you're using examples from sources in your research, the sources that you have, and it's fine to use the same two sources that you did your OPCVL on. Just don't repeat your OPCVL like word for word because it's not the same section. You're not outlining the limitations. You're expanding that a little bit to talk about how and in what way historians kind of have to account for some of those limitations and what it tells us about the discipline of history, and what maybe it means that you now understand some of the challenges that historians face. Historians are not perfect and create and construct history using sources that have flaws. So, knowing that, what are some of the ways for your topic, this becomes like something to talk about, right? So you're kind of suggesting your own awareness. So this is like personal, but it also is like applied to the discipline of history. The things that you're scored on, you have three things, and I've got them here in red, and I'm kind of noting this is like a 4 points on the rubric. They only have two categories, or, you can get a 0, you can get a 1 to a 2, or a 3 to a 4. And, you're looking to just achieve these three things to get a 3 or a 4. The reflection is clearly focused on what the investigation highlighted to the student about the methods used by the historian. Okay, so you'll get a 0 on the reflection if you talk about your own research, or you talk about how your laptop died, or that you couldn't find, this on JSTOR because your school, or you hit a paywall, or those kinds of things are not of interest to this. You're really focused on how your process and the sources that you looked at. So you looked at something from the New York Times, from 1914, and, you were interested in examining some more about a particular, part of that newspaper, but you were trying to find an additional, source that would corroborate that source, and it was difficult to find. Maybe some of the language used in the newspaper wasn't, used in other sources, so you had to make some kind of reasonable assumptions about what the newspaper journalist meant, or whatever it might be, right? You're using some examples to talk about how historians sometimes might have challenges when looking at newspaper sources because of, X, Y, and Z. So various kinds of sources might have their unique challenges. How does your experience connect to the role of the historian who might be researching your topic? Okay. The other thing that you're doing is you're demonstrating clear awareness of challenges. So, you're not really listing all the ways in which you behaved like an historian. That would be boring in your reflection. Just, I did this and I did this, I did this. The whole exercise is historical method. But along the way that you're mentioning maybe one or two examples of historical methods that you applied, use that to then get into what was really challenging. And this is where you should use two sources. And the sample that I post for you is a student who actually has two sources that have different arguments, and the student decides which argument is more credible. And, there's a reasoning process that the kid goes through to make that argument. This is why I picked this source as being more credible and not this source. And, even whether or not it's accurate or not, or other historians would agree or whatever, you're looking to showcase your reasoning. The very last thing that you want to do is there's clear and explicit connection between the reflection and the rest of the investigation. So you don't want to like shoot something off that's going to be very broad and, just deal with like history in general. All historians face challenges in dealing with sources is like way too broad. So you're, in the research that I did, historians might be most challenged by looking at battlefield accounts of Napoleon's, Battle of Waterloo. One of the reasons is different authors, talked about the dates differently. Sometimes people who appeared to be at the same battle, dated them very differently. And, whatever the issue was that you like actually ran into with the sources, talk about that. And does that discussion actually connect with the rest of your investigation? If you're talking about sources related to a battle that Napoleon was in and some of the weaknesses of those sources, it should also be reflected in your analysis, your investigation. It should be reflected in your OPCVLs, somewhere else so it matches. Okay. And that is it. Okay. I will post an example. It comes from the IB folks. I hope that that is helpful.